It's a great pleasure to be here, and simply because I've observed the doing of business, ease of doing business since 2005 when I joined Confederation of Indian Industry as the chief economist. And at that instance, actually, I was responsible. We partnered the World Bank, the CII partnered the World Bank to do that index, prepare that index. And I can't forget the time when the government of India would refuse to recognize the index. And when you went to the DIPP or to the Ministry of Finance with the results, etc., the common refrain that you heard was that, well, this is just not right, and they don't know what they're doing, and they cannot accept, and we cannot accept this ranking that you got. And I think at that time it was 136 out of the 189 or something. So, I'm recounting that simply to say that we have actually come a very long way from there, from 2005 to 2015, that at least the government of India now recognizes that there is some merit in looking at this index and seeing the movement on that index as to where India is ranked, etc. Simply because it gives you something which is quasi, if not fully objective, in terms of being ranked with the rest of the other countries, the rest of the world, knowing that the investor has a choice about going to different destinations with the investment. So I think that's a big movement, and I think it's even but just for me to say that the first instance that I had of regulation and lack of economic freedom and doing business, etc., was when I first joined the government in 1989 in the Ministry of Industry. I had an administrative officer, a wizened old man who had retired and then was hired as a consultant, to whom I went with some minor problem, who told me, Dr. Kumar, in government, everything is possible. You show me a face and I'll show you a rule. And which is the exact opposite of that. Actually, what implies is that if I see a face which I don't like, I can build a whole case against that face. And therefore, the economic freedom is actually totally arbitrary. And totally arbitrary. It doesn't depend upon any set of norms. People can be dealt with as officials want. And that is the time when I began to realize that a lot of regulation and a lot of this legalistic approach to change or to transition is actually in our countries comes about. The motivation perhaps is not as much as doing a positive turn or doing bringing about a positive change in the economic environment or the ecosystem, but maybe much more is how do I use this to generate rents for myself? And that, I think, is something which we need to look at very carefully as to what is the motivating factor for creating a set of rules and regulations, etc., in any society or any economy. Because if it remains rent generation, and if that is the use at which they are put to, then I'm afraid you may well have a whole set of rules and regulations and norms and so on, but they, in practice on the ground, they might translate into something very different. And this is where I think that while Mr. Montanari and the Institute is doing absolutely commendable work in creating this index of property rights, etc., the question would arise as to what is the where is the coverage of that? What are we covering in that index? Because in India, as we know, what I'm trying to refer, the marked dualism in the economy, between what we call Bharat and India, between what we have as as a whole panoply of rules on the top, but their lack of enforceability on the ground, or as they apply to the modern sector or to the non-modern sector. So if you create an index, for example, which is based on a survey of all the large top 500 Indian companies, you will get a completely different result from a survey that you will do for people who I say are below the radar, or in the MSME sectors, who employ 89% of your of your labor or produce 60% of your output, etc. So I am actually very interested in knowing as to how any index is created for India, because unless we are clear as to that we are covering the country as it exists in all its heterogeneity, in all its complexity, then I'm afraid what we might be representing, because I'm actually very pleasantly surprised that we are 46th in the Freedom of Economic Index, honestly, because what I see around me, in terms of, when you're talking about legal and property rights, etc. With the, I forget, but I mean, sort of lakhs of cases pending in courts. Something like 350,000 even in the High Court, etc. And the sort of things that you see in the lower courts, the longevity of civil cases going beyond 20 years and generations having to fight for their own, legal rights, which are, very much there. That, I'm not sure as to, whether the kind of rank that you've got, that you've got 4.5, etc., is something that we deserve. Especially if one recognizes that what the index is doing is to, in some sense, give a absolute rank. It's not relative to other country. I mean, you're doing this out of 10. So which is, 10 is the best, and you can't become better than 10. And then if you got 4.5 or 5, that means that we're already midway up there. And I'm not sure whether, and it's not the time to go into details of what the legal, situation, the judicial situation in this country is, but the fact remains that the enforcement of contracts, if it does take as long as 8 years, which is the World Bank's ease of doing surveys finding, and the fact that you've got complete lack of transparency in something like, change of land use, which is the farmer's basic fundamental right, then I'm not sure as to how we are almost halfway up there. Now, not for a minute am I trying to compare India with anybody else. I mean, the fact that China ranks at the same level as us, with the same ranking is also very surprising. But nonetheless, my simple submission is that I think we need to look at the coverage of our basic data source for India very differently. And the two suggestions that I might make in this regard are, one, that it will be very useful to cover, the MSMEs, and the Bharat, not the India. If you wanted to create a real, a true index for India's economic freedom. And two, maybe what you need to do is to look at India's states differently. Because the range of the range that exists between some state in India, maybe where the rule of law is pretty much absent, if you like, and then if you go to Maharashtra or somewhere, or Goa. I mean, if for example, if one survey was based only on a state like Goa or Kerala or Karnataka, etc., you might get India's rank well up there at 7 or something like that. But if you went to Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, and other places, you will get something very different. So I'm not sure as to how we are averaging across this very heterogeneous, very different situations. So that's the second. And ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, standing in for somebody else means that I am offering to you, more my sort of, assorted thoughts rather than any sort of worked out thesis. But going forward in this, my own sort of, let me start by saying that I've been observing the Indian agriculture now for the last 3 years rather closely, simply because, I felt that is one of the, on paper, one of the most economically free sector. It's the sector where there is all private sector, there is no government ownership, etc., etc. But when you observe more closely, you find that it is the most highly intervened sector in the economy. And everything from input prices, output prices, change of land, use of land, the cost of electricity, everything is controlled by the government. And the basic thing that I noticed there is that in India, the farmer today feels completely, in some sense, bound by the state as to what he can do in terms of, because the minimum support prices in some sense govern what he wants to produce, given the risk profile. The input prices governs also as to what he must use, and so on. So, and then the most important one is that, this whole business of acquiring land and the change of land use, which is so non-transparent and which is so completely arbitrary that I cannot see as to how the farmer begins to even sort of, plan his future for any length of time, because he doesn't. Just a very small example, I go to a village close by near Hapur, where I'm told now about, the rumor is that there will be a 2-lane road constructed through some villages. And all the farmers there have now begun to sort of worry as to what will happen to their land, and in some sense seizing all investment activity. Now, whether this road will happen, not happen, how their land will be acquired or not acquired is something that is up in the air. But nonetheless, it creates a completely uncertain and a non-trusting environment in the countries, in the major sector, which is still, has 50% of the population living there, and which, according to the latest socio-economic census that was released, is in a terrible shape as far as you can make out. So I think the first thing that I would suggest here is that when we talk about economic freedom in India, at least, we must talk about doing something which will generate or create much greater trust between the state and the productive agents in the country. Whether it is these are productive agents in the industry, or the medium and small enterprises, or these are farmers, or these are, if you like, workers, because I think today that trust is completely broken. None of the productive agents in the country, I think the great majority of them, actually have any trust that the government will act on their behalf or in their interest going forward. And unless and this is what I wrote, for example, a series of articles on the land acquisition law, and I said the first step that the government should be taking, for example, is to create a list, of all the land that the government already owns in each district, and therefore to assure the farmer that they will use that land before acquiring anything else in that district. Now, if they had done this, the farmer would then be be satisfied that this is the government will act on my behalf and not just simply expropriate me as I go. So I think the economic freedom, the basic fundamental condition for me is the generation of that trust, and for the people, for the civil society, for the productive agents to believe that the government is not an exploitative state. And some people have used the word predatory state. I mean, let's not go that far, but at least the relationship between a state which you elect yourself and yourself is not that of an exploitative one, which was the case earlier. So that's the first sort of thing that I would want, that's one thing that I need to sort of emphasize. And how do you do this? I think you do this by creating much greater transparency and much greater accountability. And in the Center for Policy Research, there is an accountability initiative that is going on, and people are sort of working on that. And I think here what they have found themselves is that you can use the new technology to achieve that much better. And I think maybe what you can do in creating this index as you go forward, Mr. Montanari, is also to try and figure in, sort of put in how technology can be used to create that sort of, the transparency and index. Ladies and gentlemen, just one other example, because I've been working on this for some time, and that's of intellectual property. And intellectual property, as you said yourself, is a very fine balancing act. We need to protect the interests of the producers as well as that of the consumers, and that balance is not very easy to achieve. And I give you just one example that has come to my notice very recently through a friend who's been working for his lifetime in the public sector R&D space, whereby he's pointed out that now the government, the UGC, requires all PhD scholars in India to give a proof when they write the thesis, when they submit their PhD thesis, to give a proof that they have not plagiarized anything from anywhere else. Now that's now the law, and that law is so difficult to implement because the PhD scholars can be all over the place to sort of prove as to how you prove that you've not plagiarized anything from anywhere. Maybe this is a good thing to do because given that you want your PhDs not to be a cut and paste job. But at the same time, this friend of mine points out, and he is somebody who's been working in, I think, quantum physics for a while, that there are a large number of Indian PhD theses which are then taken over by other scholars in other countries and used then to publish their results elsewhere. But there is no protection against them, for them against that sort of an incident. Now, what I'm trying to point out is that what you have to do intellectual property is, therefore create a system by which you promote and incentivize your own intellectual property creation, as well as prevent people from sort of transgressing or misusing others' intellectual property rights. The same thing can happen in the industry, as I've noticed. I've noticed time and again when many inventions or innovations, I think that's a better word, which come out of the smaller sectors, where people who are unable to defend those innovations for themselves are taken over by larger corporations without as much as enough or as much as a sort of, a credit to the smaller innovator. So again, I think in this area of intellectual property lies, it's not just a matter of saying that you look, the patents and the copyright and trademarks have to be protected, and all the benefits go to therefore to the larger corporations, the larger boys. It is the people who are on the ground, who are actually fighting a battle for survival, who create innovations at the margin for them to continue with their businesses. I think their interests are as important to be protected as that of the larger corporations. And just finally, in this field of intellectual property right, and given that the Indian drugs and pharmaceuticals industry is such a big, important, sort of factor, and has had a major, been a focus of major discussions for many, many decades, the fact remains that the production of generics, as opposed to the patented drugs, has brought about a large amount of benefit to the ordinary patient and the consumer. But how do you balance that from production of spurious drugs, for example? And how do you balance that from creating incentives for R&D in pharmaceuticals, which are, of course, very cost incentive? And to that extent, I mean, I've just been looking at recently, and I bring it to all your attention, is what I would call the Gilead model. The Gilead is a multinational which is based out of California, works on retroactive drugs and sort of anti-cancer drugs and so on. And what they have come up with is a franchising system whereby they can bring the latest drug and the latest invention to the realm of the smaller producer or to the national producer, and allow them the facility to produce that drug at very different prices for local markets, while they themselves hold the patent for the OECD markets and for the richer country markets. The general point that one is making is that, can we come up with a system across industries whereby intellectual property and protection of it can be used for differentiated pricing, which will benefit both, which will balance the right of the producer as well as the consumer? I think that's a way forward. That's something that we need to think about, because at least so far I have not found that in economic literature. With those few words, thank you very much for inviting me here.